For years, you were told a story. A line was drawn separating Jesus from Judaism. A clear line, a safe line, a line you were not meant to cross. But there were those who tried to look beyond it, and when they did, they didn't find answers. They found a wall of laws, of tradition, of a system that wasn't there in the beginning. But what if that line was never real? And what if that wall was built much later? So what was really there in the beginning?
For centuries, Christians around the world have told a simple story about the gospel. The story begins in Israel, where Jesus of Nazareth appears, teaches, and is proclaimed as the Messiah. Then the message spreads beyond the borders of Israel. It crosses languages, cultures, and empires until the nations of the world begin to believe in the God of Israel. To many believers, that seems like the natural ending of the story. The gospel began with the Jews, and then it moved on to the nations. But what if that familiar story is missing something important? What if the writings of the Apostle Paul reveal a pattern hidden beneath the surface of the gospel itself? A pattern that begins in Israel, reaches the nations, and then points back again to Israel in a way few people have ever noticed. In one remarkable passage, Paul describes the salvation of the nations with a phrase that almost sounds shocking. Through their trespass, salvation has come to the Gentiles, to make Israel jealous. Why would the faith of the nations provoke Israel? What role were the nations meant to play in the unfolding story of God? And what did Paul believe might happen if Israel one day looked again at its own Messiah? To answer those questions, we have to return to a chapter of Scripture that many believers have read, but very few have explored deeply. A chapter about an olive tree, a chapter about branches grafted in, and a chapter that reveals the relationship between Israel and the nations in a way that changes how the entire story of the gospel is understood. Because according to Paul, when the message of the Messiah reached the nations, that was not the end of the story. In many ways, it was only the beginning. To understand the mystery Paul describes, we have to return to the beginning of the story itself. Long before the message of the gospel spread across continents, before churches appeared throughout the Roman world, the story was rooted in one small land and one ancient people. Jesus of Nazareth did not appear in Rome, Athens, or Alexandria. He appeared in Israel. He was born among the people of Israel, raised within their traditions, and taught from their scriptures. His disciples were Jews who had grown up hearing the promises given to their ancestors. The language of the prophets, the covenant with Abraham, the story of Moses and David, these were not distant religious ideas to them. They were the very fabric of their identity. When Jesus spoke about the kingdom of God, he was speaking into a story that had already been unfolding for centuries among the people of Israel. And when his followers began proclaiming that the Messiah had come, they were not announcing the birth of a new religion. They believed they were witnessing the fulfillment of promises that had belonged to Israel from the beginning. In those earliest days, the message of the Messiah did not spread outward into the nations. It remained within Israel, among Jews who believed that the long-awaited redemption of their people had finally begun. The first believers prayed in the temple courts. They gathered in the streets of Jerusalem. They spoke about the God of Israel and the Messiah of Israel. In every way, the movement that would later transform the world was still deeply rooted in the life of one people. The gospel did not begin as a global message detached from Israel. It began as the continuation of Israel's own story. A story in which the God who had spoken through the prophets was now acting in a way that would eventually draw the attention of the entire world. But the story does not remain confined within Israel for long. Within a few years, something remarkable begins to unfold. The message about Israel's Messiah starts moving beyond the borders of the land where it began. At the center of this turning point stands a man whose life itself seems to embody the tension between Israel and the nations. Saul of Tarsus, known to the world as Paul, was a Jew trained in the traditions of Israel, a student of the scriptures, a man deeply devoted to the God of his ancestors. Yet his life would become the bridge through which the message of Israel's Messiah traveled into the vast world of the Roman Empire. City after city, road after road, Paul journeys across regions that had never heard the story of Israel's God in this way before. Antioch, Corinth, Ephesus, Thessalonica, Rome. In each place, the same surprising scene begins to unfold. People from the nations Greeks, Romans, men and women who were not born into Israel's covenant story, begin to listen. They hear about the God of Abraham. They hear the ancient promises of the prophets. They hear the announcement that the Messiah of Israel has come. And something unexpected happens. They believe. Communities of believers begin appearing far beyond the land of Israel. In crowded port cities along Roman trade routes and homes and marketplaces across the empire, people from the nations begin worshiping the God of Israel. They open the scriptures that had once belonged only to Israel. They pray to the God who had revealed himself to the patriarchs. They speak about the Messiah who had walked the roads of Judea. To many observers, it would have looked like the center of the story was shifting. What began in Israel now seemed to be taking root among the nations of the world. And yet, as Paul traveled across the empire, he never believed that Israel's story had ended. In fact, everywhere he went, he followed the same deliberate pattern. Before speaking to the crowds of Gentiles, before teaching in the marketplaces or homes of the nations, Paul always began in the same place. He went first to the synagogue. He reasoned with the Jewish communities from the scriptures. Again and again, the same words appear in the book of Acts. Paul entered the synagogue and spoke with the Jews first. This was not a habit of convenience. It was a pattern he believed was deeply connected to the design of the gospel itself. Because Paul never saw the message of the Messiah as something that had moved on from Israel. Even as the nations began to believe, the story remained rooted in the people through whom it had first begun. And it is precisely at this moment, when the gospel is spreading rapidly among the nations, that Paul begins to explain a mystery that would reshape how the relationship between Israel and the nations should be understood. As the message of the Messiah continued spreading across the Roman world, a question naturally began to arise among the early believers. What did this growing faith among the nations mean for Israel? To many observers, the situation seemed to suggest that something had changed in the story of God. Israel had been the center of the covenant for centuries, yet now communities of Gentile believers were appearing everywhere. Had the nations replaced Israel? Had the story moved on from the people through whom it first began? When Paul writes to the believers in Rome, he confronts this question directly, and the answer he gives reveals what he calls a mystery. A mystery, not because it is hidden forever, but because it can only be understood when the entire story is seen together. To explain it, Paul uses an image from the natural world that every listener in the ancient Mediterranean would immediately recognize: an olive tree. In Paul's description, the tree represents the long story of God's covenant with Israel, the promises given to Abraham, the words spoken through the prophets, the faithfulness of God unfolding through generations. The roots of this tree run deep into the soil of Israel's history. But then Paul describes something unusual happening to that tree. Some branches are broken off and branches from a wild olive tree. Branches that did not originally belong are grafted into the cultivated tree. These wild branches represent the nations. People who were once strangers to the covenant of Israel are now being connected to the life flowing from that ancient root. For the first time, men and women from every nation are receiving the promises that had long been associated with the people of Israel. But Paul is careful to explain what this image does and does not mean. The nations are not a new tree replacing the old one. They are not the root of the story. They are branches that have been grafted into a story that existed long before they arrived. The root supports them, not the other way around. The God of Israel has not abandoned his covenant story. Instead, he has extended its life outward so that the nations themselves can share in its blessings. And this is where the mystery begins to deepen, because according to Paul, the presence of these new branches, the faith of the nations themselves, will eventually affect the original tree in a profound way. The story is not moving away from Israel. Instead, something about the faith of the nations will one day turn the attention of Israel back toward its own Messiah. In Paul's mind, the arrival of the nations into the covenant story was never meant to end Israel's role. It was meant to set the stage for something still unfolding in the future. This is where Paul's words begin to touch something deeper than theology. Because when he speaks about the nations being grafted into Israel's story, he is not describing a minor detail in the unfolding of the gospel. He is describing the role of millions of people who would one day come to believe in the God of Israel. People who were once strangers to the covenants, strangers to the promises, strangers to the scriptures of Israel. And yet, according to Paul, they were never meant to remain outsiders. They were invited into the living story of God's covenant with the world. But the astonishing part of Paul's message is that the nations were not simply invited to receive salvation and then stand quietly on the sidelines. Their faith itself was meant to become part of the unfolding drama of redemption. When the nations began worshiping the God of Abraham, reading the prophets of Israel, and believing in the Messiah who came through Israel, something entirely new was happening in human history. For the first time, the God of Israel was being honored by people from every nation under heaven. The ancient promises given to one people were now echoing across the world. And Paul believed that this moment would eventually speak back to Israel itself. Imagine what he envisioned. Jewish communities scattered throughout the Roman world, and hearing reports that in distant cities, people who were not born into Israel's covenant were now praying to Israel's God, studying Israel's scriptures, and placing their hope in Israel's Messiah. The nations were discovering the treasure that had once belonged only to Israel. And Paul believed that when Israel saw this, something powerful could happen. Not rivalry, not hostility, but a kind of longing. A realization that the promises given to their ancestors were still alive, still powerful, still changing lives. This is why Paul uses the word jealousy. Not the jealousy of resentment, but the longing that awakens when someone sees another person experiencing a blessing that once belonged to them. The faith of the nations becomes a living testimony that the God of Israel has not abandoned his promises, that the covenant story is still unfolding, that the Messiah of Israel is still drawing people into the life of God. And in this way, the nations are not merely recipients of grace. They become witnesses to it. Their lives become evidence that the God of Israel is not only the God of one people, but the God whose promises were always meant to reach the whole world. But even as Paul speaks about the privilege of the nations, he reminds them of something essential. The root still supports the branches. The story still begins with Israel. The promises still belong to the people through whom God first spoke to the world. The nations are not replacing that story. They are participating in it. They are living proof that the God of Israel is faithful to his covenant. And according to Paul, this participation carries a profound purpose. Because when the nations walk humbly within this story, honoring the root that supports them, loving the people through whom the promises first came, and living in the life of the Messiah, they may awaken something that has been waiting for generations. They may become part of the moment when Israel itself begins to look again at the Messiah who first came to them. And when that moment arrives, Paul hints that the consequences could reach far beyond Israel alone. The faith of the nations, he believed, could help prepare the world for a turning point in the story of redemption itself. You think making Israel jealous means copying Jewish practices. And honestly, it sounds logical at first, because if Israel has Shabbat, then maybe we should keep Shabbat. And if Israel has the feasts, then maybe we should celebrate the feasts. And if Israel has Torah, then maybe we should take it on ourselves. But here's the problem no one really stops to think about. Does imitation actually create jealousy? Or does it just blur the lines until there's nothing left to react to? Because jealousy only happens when something is clearly yours appears somewhere it shouldn't be. Not when someone simply mirrors what you already have. Now, don't misunderstand this, because this is important. There is something beautiful about the desire behind it. There is something right about wanting to honor what God gave in the scriptures. The feasts are not random traditions. They are appointed times. The rhythms are not man-made inventions. They are woven into the story itself. And when people from the nations begin to respect that, to lean into that, even to celebrate that, it can genuinely touch something deep in a Jewish heart. Because it shows honor, it shows recognition, it shows that what God did with Israel still matters. But here's where everything quietly shifts without people realizing it. Because what begins as honor can slowly turn into identity. And what begins as appreciation can turn into imitation, and before long, the focus is no longer on encountering the God of Israel, but on trying to resemble Israel itself. And that shift is subtle, but critical. Because you can adopt practices without ever being transformed. You can take on rhythms without ever meeting the one who gave them. And when that happens, something essential is lost, even though everything on the outside looks right. So instead of asking, what should we do? Maybe the real question is one that almost no one is asking, and it's this. What actually causes jealousy in the first place? What is it that would make someone look at another and feel that something deeply familiar has appeared in a place it doesn't belong? Because if we don't answer that correctly, we might spend years building something that looks right on the surface, but completely misses the very thing it was supposed to produce. Because here's the tension that most people don't see yet. The Jewish people already have a system that preserves practices. They already have a framework that guards every detail, every boundary, every expression of life around God. And it has been developed, refined, and protected for generations. So if the answer was simply more people copying those same practices, then nothing new would actually appear, nothing unexpected would emerge, and nothing would provoke the kind of response Paul is describing, which means we are probably looking in the wrong direction. Because the truth is, the Jewish people already have something most people from the outside don't fully understand. They already have a system that is incredibly detailed, incredibly disciplined, and incredibly committed to preserving every aspect of life connected to God. From the smallest daily actions to the highest holy days, everything is structured. Everything is guarded and everything is taken seriously, and this system is known today as Rabbinic Judaism, a framework that has developed over centuries with one clear goal: to protect, preserve, and define how the people of Israel live in relation to God. But here's where a distinction must be made, and it's a distinction that almost no one talks about clearly because there's a difference between the faith of the scriptures and the system that later grew around it. There's a difference between what we see in the lives of Abraham, Moses, David, and the prophets, and what developed generations later as a structured religious framework. And unless you see that difference, everything becomes blurred, because you start assuming that what exists today is exactly what was always meant to be, when in reality, something has shifted over time. And this is where something deeply important is happening right now, because many Israelis today are not rejecting God, they are not walking away from the idea of faith. They are actually searching. But what they are searching for is not more structure, not more rules, not more layers of tradition, because in many cases, they already feel surrounded by that. What they're searching for is something far more basic and far more powerful. They are searching for the God they read about in the scriptures. Because from a young age, Israeli children grow up reading the Bible in school. They see the stories. They hear about a God who speaks, who moves, who intervenes in history, a God who calls people, leads people, delivers people. And then something happens. They look at the reality around them, and they don't always see that same God reflected in the systems they know. And so the question begins to form, sometimes quietly, sometimes out loud, the same question Gideon once asked. Where is the God our fathers told us about? And this is the tension, because when faith becomes primarily about maintaining structure, it is possible to preserve everything externally while losing something internally. It is possible to have the calendar, the practices, the language, the identity, and yet still feel that something is missing. And many people feel that, even if they don't always know how to articulate it. Because deep down, they're not just looking for a system to follow. They are looking for a God who is real. So now come back to the original idea. If someone from the nations looks at this and says, the solution is to copy the system, then what exactly are they adding? What new thing is being revealed? What unexpected reality is appearing? Because if all that is happening is more people adopting the same external structure, then nothing changes, nothing challenges, nothing provokes, and certainly nothing creates the kind of tension that would make someone stop and ask deeper questions. So now we have to ask the question that changes everything. What actually creates jealousy? Because jealousy is not a reaction to imitation. It is a reaction to something real appearing in an unexpected place. It is when something that feels deeply familiar, something that belongs to you, suddenly shows up somewhere it should not be, and not as a copy, not as an imitation, but as something alive, something undeniable, something that cannot be easily explained away. Because imitation can be explained, imitation can be categorized, imitation can be dismissed as someone trying to adopt a culture or a system, but presence is different. Presence is something you feel, something you recognize, even if you don't want to admit it. And when the God of Israel is visibly at work, not in theory, not in language, but in reality, that is something no system can contain and no explanation can fully neutralize. And this is where the tension becomes almost uncomfortable, because the idea is not that the nations become Israel. The idea is that the God of Israel becomes visible among the nations, not replacing Israel, not redefining Israel, but appearing in a place where he was not expected to be seen in that way, and that creates a kind of friction that cannot be ignored, because it forces a question that cuts deeper than tradition. Because imagine seeing something that feels like it belongs to your story, your history, your God, but it is happening in people who were never part of that story. People who did not grow up with your identity, your language, your traditions, and yet somehow there is something there that feels authentic, something that carries weight, something that feels alive, and that creates a tension that imitation never could. That is the moment where questions begin. Not the kind of questions people ask in debates, but the kind that sit quietly and refuse to go away. The kind that makes someone wonder whether what they have assumed all along is incomplete, whether something has been missed. whether there is more to the story than what they have known. And this is not triggered by someone copying what already exists. It is triggered by something that feels real enough to challenge what exists. Because external form has a limit. It can guide behavior, it can preserve identity, it can create continuity, but it cannot produce life on its own. And this is where everything shifts. Because if what people are truly searching for is life, if what they are longing for is a real encounter with God, then no amount of external imitation will satisfy that. And no amount of structure will replace that. And when something real appears, when there is transformation, when there is a visible connection to the God of Israel, that is not based on imitation, but on something deeper, something internal, something that cannot be manufactured, that is when the difference becomes undeniable. That is when it is no longer about what someone is doing, but about what is actually happening. And that is the point where everything changes. So let's bring this into focus, because this is where many people get pulled in two directions. On one side, there is a genuine desire to honor what God gave, to respect the scriptures, to take seriously the feasts, the rhythms, the things that were entrusted to Israel. And that desire is not wrong. It is good. It is healthy. It reflects a recognition that what God established was not meaningless and not temporary. But the danger comes when that respect turns into confusion, when honoring what God gave becomes replacing the very thing that gives it life. Because the heart of the matter was never about external form alone. It was never about who can replicate the system more accurately. It was always about something deeper, something internal, something that the prophets spoke about again and again. A change that does not begin on the outside, but on the inside. Something that cannot be achieved by copying behavior. Something that cannot be inherited by tradition, but something that must happen within a person. And this is why so many in Israel today are not impressed by imitation, because they already have a system that preserves the external. They already have a framework that defines the details. What they're searching for is not more of the same. What they're searching for is something that feels like the God of the scriptures is actually present again. Not as an idea, not as a tradition, but as a reality, something that moves, something that speaks, something that can be encountered. So if the nations think the answer is to become Israel, to take on the identity, the structure, the outward form, then something essential is lost. Because the distinction disappears, the sign becomes unclear. And what could have created a real question instead becomes something familiar, something explainable, something that does not challenge anything at all. But if something else happens, if the nations remain who they are, and yet the God of Israel becomes visible among them, if there is transformation, if there is life, if there is something that cannot be reduced to imitation, then something completely different appears. Something that cannot be ignored. Something that forces a deeper question. Something that creates tension, not because it copies what exists, but because it reveals something real, where it was not expected. So the question is not how closely can we resemble Israel. The question is not how accurately can we reproduce the system. The real question is far more unsettling, far more direct, and far more important. And it is this: where is the God of Israel? And can he be seen among the nations? What if the version of Judaism you see today never actually existed in the Bible? Not as a system, not as a structure, not the way you think. Because when you go back to Abraham, to Moses, to the prophets, you don't find layers of rules and interpretation. You find something else, something simpler, something direct. In this video, we're going to test everything. Not by tradition, not by assumptions, but by the text itself. And by the end, you'll have to answer one question. Are you looking at what God gave, or something that came later and took its place? Stay with me. You think you know what Judaism is? You've seen it, maybe on the streets, maybe online, maybe in documentaries or conversations. And in your mind, it looks ancient, structured, detailed, something preserved carefully over thousands of years, something that feels like it comes straight out of the Bible, and without even realizing it. You've already made a huge assumption that what you're looking at today is the same thing that existed back then. But here's what we're going to do in this video. And I want you to stay with me all the way to the end, because this builds step by step. We're going to take what you think is obvious, and we're going to test it against the Bible itself, not tradition, not what people say, not what you've always heard, but the text. And by the end, you're going to have to answer one uncomfortable question. Are these actually the same thing? When you hear the word Judaism, something specific comes to mind. Black clothing, prayer shawls, strict rules about what you can and can't do, detailed laws about food, about time, about behavior, about identity, a system that touches every part of life and defines it. And it feels old, it feels rooted, it feels like this must be what God gave. And here's the part no one says out loud. You assume this is a direct continuation, that nothing essential changed, that this is just the Bible lived out over time, that what you see today is simply a more developed version of what started with Abraham, Moses, and the prophets. But let me ask you something simple, and don't answer quickly. Just think about it for a second. When you open the Bible, do you actually see any of that system there? Or are you reading that system back into the text because it's what you already expect to find? Because the moment you slow down and actually look, something starts to feel off. Not dramatically at first, just a small tension, like something doesn't fully line up, like you're expecting to see one thing, and you're seeing something else. What if the version of Judaism you have in your mind never actually existed in the world of the Bible? And before you react to that, before you push back, before you say, that can't be right, just stay with the question, because we're not going to attack anything. We're not going to argue emotionally. We're going to do something much more dangerous. We're going to look, not to what people say about the Bible, not to what traditions claim, but to the text itself. Because if something truly comes from God, it should be visible where God first revealed it. So here's the tension that starts to build. And this is where most people subconsciously look away. If what you see today is truly biblical, then you should be able to clearly see its structure, its authority, its system, right there in the scriptures. But what if you don't? What if instead of a system, you see something else entirely, something much simpler, something much more direct, something that doesn't match the image you've been carrying? Because here's the reality most people never test. You don't actually know if what you're looking at is biblical. You've just always been told it is. And that's exactly what we're going to challenge. Not emotionally, not politically, but surgically, piece by piece, by going back to the beginning and asking a question that sounds simple but changes everything. What does the Bible actually show? Because if the answer matches what you see today, then everything stands, nothing changes, and the system is exactly what it claims to be. Or if it doesn't, then you're not dealing with a continuation. You're dealing with something else. And that brings us to the question that almost no one wants to ask out loud. The question that sits right under the surface of everything we've said so far. Are you looking at biblical Judaism? Or are you looking at something that came later and assumed its place? Don't answer yet, because once we go back to the Bible itself and actually look at what's there, you're going to have to decide. So let's do what almost no one actually does. Let's go back, not to what developed later, not to what people say, but to the Bible itself. And instead of assuming what we're going to find, let's actually look at what's there. Because if something truly comes from God, it should be visible at the source, not just in what came after. Start with Abraham, the man everything begins with, the father of the faith, the one God chose to start the story. And what you see is almost shocking in its simplicity. There is no religious system, no institutional structure, no hierarchy, no legal framework controlling his daily life. There is just a man who hears God and responds, who leaves his land, trusts a promise, and walks forward without a system guiding every step. And this should immediately create tension, because if Abraham is the foundation, then the foundation is not a system, not a structure, not a detailed religious machine. It is relationship, trust, and direct response to the voice of God. Now move forward to Moses, because if anywhere you expect to find a full system, it's here. This is Sinai. This is the giving of the Torah. This is where everything should become complex and structured, but what you actually see is something very different. Moses receives words from God, writes them down, and gives them to the people as something clear, something meant to be heard, remembered, and lived. And the text itself keeps insisting on something most people ignore, that these commandments are not hidden, not distant, not too difficult, not dependent on a class of interpreters, but near, understandable, accessible, given in a way that assumes the people themselves can hear and respond. If the Torah needed a massive system to explain it, why does the Torah say the opposite? Look carefully, not quickly. You won't find rabbis, you won't find a chain of oral transmission, you won't find instructions to consult a body of interpreters, you won't find a second layer running alongside the written word. What you find is something radically simple. God speaks, it is written, and the people are called to obey. Now look at David, a king, a man described as after God's own heart. And what you see is not someone navigating a complex religious system, but someone living in direct relationship. When he fails, when he breaks, when everything collapses, he doesn't consult a framework. He doesn't perform a structured process. He cries out directly to God, asking for a clean heart. Not ritual, not formula, but something internal, something real. And at this point, something should begin to feel different. Because what you're seeing does not match the image you started with. The system you assumed was ancient and biblical is not appearing in the text the way you expected. Even worship itself doesn't look the way people imagine today. It's not scattered across institutions. It's not built on daily ritual systems everywhere. It's centered, specific, tied to the temple, and outside of that, life with God is not about performing a system. It is about living in covenant, walking in obedience, responding to what has already been given. And when the people drift, when they lose their way, when things begin to collapse spiritually, God does not send more rules. He does not create more layers of interpretation. He sends prophets, not scholars, not legal authorities, but voices that call people back to what was already written. God didn't solve spiritual drift by adding more structure. He solved it by calling people back to Him. This is a completely different world, not a world built on endless rulings, not a world defined by layers of expansion, not a world where authority comes from interpretation, but a world where God speaks and people are expected to listen. The scriptures never present themselves as incomplete, never suggest they require another system to function, never point to a hidden layer that must be unlocked by experts. They stand as the authority, clear and sufficient. And now the gap begins to form clearly, because what you see in the Bible is not what most people think of when they think of Judaism today, not in structure, not in authority, not in how people relate to God. So now the question becomes sharper, more focused, harder to ignore. If this is what the original looks like, then how did we get from this to what exists today? And this is the moment where everything begins to shift, because the answer to that question is not theoretical, it is historical. And once you see that shift clearly, the entire picture changes. Don't look away here, because this is the point where most people stop, not because the answer isn't clear, but because it's uncomfortable, because it forces you to rethink what you've always assumed. But if you stay with it, if you follow the line honestly, you're about to see exactly where the change happened. And it didn't happen in theory. It didn't happen in a classroom. It didn't happen as a slow philosophical idea. It happened in a real moment, under real pressure, when everything that people depended on suddenly disappeared. This didn't happen as an idea. It didn't happen as a quiet theological shift. It happened in a moment that shattered everything at once. The temple is destroyed. Jerusalem falls. The center of worship collapses. The place where the people met God is gone. The altar is gone. The sacrifices are gone. The priesthood is no longer functioning as it once did. And in a single moment, the entire structure that defined Israel's relationship with God disappears. This is not a small crisis. This is not a temporary disruption. This is a complete collapse of the system that existed in the Bible. No temple, no sacrifices, no central place of worship. And something even deeper, no active prophetic voice speaking clearly to the people. No, thus says the Lord. No direct guidance cutting through the confusion. And in that silence, something begins to form. Not because people plan to replace anything, but because they had to survive, they had to preserve identity, they had to continue as a people without the structure that once held everything together. So a new kind of leadership emerges. Not prophets who speak on behalf of God, not priests who serve in the temple, but teachers, interpreters, scholars, people who begin to study what was written and explain how it should be lived out in a world where the original system no longer exists. And at first it looks reasonable, even necessary, people gathering, discussing, preserving, trying to understand how to live without a temple, how to maintain identity in exile, how to hold on to what remains. But something begins to shift slowly, almost invisibly. Because interpretation is not the same as revelation, and once interpretation becomes central, authority begins to move. Not from God to another God, but from God to explanation. Instead of "this is what God said," the focus becomes "this is how we understand what God meant." And that difference may sound small, but it changes everything. The moment truth is no longer delivered, but discussed, no longer revealed, but interpreted, the foundation shifts, and now authority is no longer about who hears God, but who has the right to interpret what was already written. And this is where the rabbis become central, not as prophets, not as priests, but as interpreters, as those who claim the authority to define how the written word should be understood and applied. At first, their role is limited. Explanations, clarifications, attempts to protect the commandments, but explanation turns into expansion into rulings into law, and over time, a full system begins to take shape. And at a certain point, something subtle but critical happens. Interpretation stops being commentary and becomes authority, not just explaining the text, but defining it, not just guiding behavior, but determining what counts as obedience. And when interpretation becomes authority, it can override the text. This is not theory. This plays out in real life, where rulings are made, decisions are enforced, and what was once a direct command becomes surrounded by layers of human explanation that eventually carry more weight than the original words. To support this growing authority, a claim is established that alongside the written Torah, there exists an oral one, given at the same time, passed down through generations, and now held by those who interpret it. And if that claim is accepted, everything changes. because now the system is no longer just human effort, it becomes divine in its authority. And those who interpret it become the gatekeepers of truth. But look at the timeline, because this is where the tension becomes undeniable. The written Torah is ancient, but the system of oral law, as we know it, was written down much later, centuries after the events it claims to originate from, developed over time, shaped in response to history not revealed in the moment it claims to represent. What happened in between is accumulation, layers of rulings, debates, decisions, all gradually forming what becomes known as the Mishnah, and later the Talmud, not as a record of direct revelation, but as a record of interpretation. And over time, this system becomes central, not secondary, not optional, but the standard by which life is defined, behavior is judged, and identity is determined. People no longer go directly to the text, they go to what was written about the text. They study interpretations, memorize debates, follow rulings, and treat those rulings as binding, even when they go beyond what is written. And now you have something completely different from what you saw in the Bible. Not direct access to what God said, but access through a system that tells you what it means. And that system has power. It defines what is allowed, what is forbidden, what is acceptable, what is not. And eventually it defines something even more powerful, who belongs. Because once you have authority, you have the power to include and exclude, to say who is inside and who is outside, not based on what is written, but based on alignment with the system. Groups that didn't accept this authority, groups that stayed closer to the written text, groups that challenged the system, gradually disappeared, were pushed out, or were labeled as outside, not because they rejected God, but because they rejected the authority that claimed to interpret him. And this is where it becomes clear. This is not just development, not just growth, not just preservation. This is a shift in the source of authority from what was revealed to what was constructed. And now we arrive at the world you see today, where the system is established, the authority is recognized, and most people assume it has always been this way. But it hasn't. It began in a moment of crisis, grew over time, and eventually became dominant, until questioning it feels almost unthinkable. And now the question changes because you're no longer asking, what is Judaism? You're asking something much deeper. Which version are you actually looking at? So now step back for a second and look at everything you've just seen, not emotionally, not defensively, just honestly. What you saw in the Bible was direct, simple, centered on God speaking and people responding. And what you see today is structured, layered, built around interpretation and authority. And the gap between those two is no longer subtle, it's clear. And once you see that gap, the question is no longer theoretical and it becomes personal. Because now you have to decide how you understand what you're looking at. This is not about small differences, not about minor traditions, not about preferences and how people practice. This is about something much deeper, the source of authority itself, because everything depends on that. Are you following what God said? Or what someone said about what God said? Because once that line is crossed, once interpretation becomes the authority instead of the text itself, everything downstream changes. Obedience changes, identity changes, belonging changes. Even the way people understand God changes. And most people never notice because the system is so established, so normalized, so deeply woven into identity that it feels like it has always been there, like it must be the original. But it isn't. And that matters because if you start with the system, you will always read the Bible through it. You will always interpret the text according to what the system already says it means. And you will never actually encounter it on its own terms. But if you start with the text, if you strip away the assumptions and look at what is actually written, something different begins to emerge. Something simpler, something more direct, something that doesn't match the structure you expected. The Bible does not lead you into a system. It leads you into a relationship. And this is the part people resist. Because systems feel safe. Systems define boundaries. Systems tell you exactly where you stand. But relationship is different. It requires listening, responding, walking, and it cannot be controlled the same way. And this is why the shift happened. Because in a moment of crisis, when the center was gone and the voice was silent, a system provided stability. It provided structure. It gave people something to hold on to, but over time, that system became more than support. It became authority. What began as a response to loss became a replacement for what was lost. And this is not about attacking people, not about disrespecting history, not about dismissing everything that came later. It's about something much more precise, recognizing the difference between what was given and what was built. Because if you don't see that difference, you will treat everything as if it came from the same source. And once you do that, you lose the ability to distinguish between divine authority and human tradition. And that leads to one question, not about religion, not about identity, not about culture, but about truth. What did God actually give? And what came later? Because those are not the same thing. And once you ask that question honestly, everything begins to rearrange itself. Because now you are no longer anchored in assumption. You are anchored in the text itself. You begin to see that what the Bible describes is not a complex religious system, not a structure built on layers of interpretation, but a living relationship with a God who speaks. And that is where everything begins. So the next time you hear the word Judaism, don't just accept the image that comes to mind. Don't just assume continuity. Don't just trust what has been handed down without question. Stop and ask something much more unsettling. Is this really what the Bible describes? Or is this something that came later and took its place? So what is it? It's not the faith of Abraham. It's not the world of Moses. It's not the voice of the prophets. It's a system that was built to replace what was lost. And once you see that, you have to decide where you stand. Millions hear the story of Jesus through traditions shaped centuries later. This channel exists to rediscover the story as it began. This work is 100% supported by viewers like you. There is no organization behind it. If this work matters to you, consider becoming a member. The link is in the description.